What can be said about Octopath Traveler 2 that hasn't already been said? That's a question I've been contemplating for a while. I think the game's story structure is worth exploring because it has a major impact on how it feels and plays. Let's begin. Much like its predecessor, Octopath Traveler 2 lets the player choose one of 8 characters to begin with and then recruit the others along the way. Each story is largely self-contained, with the other characters acting as passive observers, allowing a greater focus on each individual arc. In some ways, this approach works well. For example, the character I chose first, Throne, has a compelling story. She's a thief who occasionally takes assassination jobs for the Blacksnakes, a criminal organization that enslaves its members through indoctrination and an invisible collar to symbolize their bondage. After a botched job leads to a colleague's death, followed by a twisted ritual that forces the others to kill each other, Throne decides she's had enough and vows to kill mother and father of the Blacksnakes to earn her freedom.
We're supposed to kill each other off until only the best of us survives.
For the first time in my life, I know what I want. I want to be free.
I have to compliment the writers on Throne's first chapter. Not only did they create a strong scenario, but they also established a sympathetic motivation for her. The struggle for freedom. That's important because what took me out of her predecessor, Therion's story, in the first game was that his motivation was basically just kleptomania.
If you collect the 3 remaining stones, we shall remove the band from your arm.
I'll do the job.
Sympathy matters for Throne because it makes her actions more tolerable to the other party members, even if they're not directly involved in her story. Think of it like this: every character recruited after her first chapter becomes a silent supporter for her fight for freedom.
My name's Agnea. I'm a dancer on a journey to become a star. Would it be alright for me to join your travels?
In contrast, Therion feels like that rogue player in a tabletop RPG whose first action upon entering a town is to rob every NPC until the party inevitably gets in trouble for it. That's why I can accept even morally upstanding characters like Hikari, Partitio, and even the cynical Temenos tolerating Throne's occasional larceny, whereas I can't imagine characters like Ophelia, Alberic, or Trissa being willing to work with Therion. While I see the other party members as silent supporters, I don't believe they're completely without agency either.
Show yourself, cleric! We want to render our judgment.
Well, this is quite the scene.
Moving on, Temenos surprisingly has a compelling narrative as well. After the pontiff, essentially the head of the church, is murdered, Temenos is tasked with investigating the assassin's trail, which leads him to the city of Cannelbrine in hot pursuit.
But to no avail, for I shall reveal him. Vados the Architect. Upon vanquishing the Flamebringer, you came here to Cannelbrine, where you easily crossed the Charitable and the Scholar King off your list. And in accordance with the scripture, your next target will be...
While chasing his intended suspect, he ultimately uncovers a larger conspiracy within the faith itself, reaching all the way to its highest authority. It's perhaps a bit generic since this kind of plot has been done many times before, but it's still intriguing enough to keep me hooked. Having each chapter dedicated to a specific character allows for a degree of narrative flexibility. However, it also presents challenges, primarily the lack of an overarching theme to connect all the characters' stories into a cohesive conclusion. For example, none of the individual antagonists is directly involved in the resurrection of Vide the Wicked, the game's primary villain, though a few turn out to be unwitting pawns of the true instigators, as revealed in the series of letters from the 3 NPCs who acted as close confidants throughout the story. While the idea of being betrayed by seemingly unremarkable NPCs is a novel concept, there was never any indication that any of them were part of a secret death cult, except for the Dark Huntress, whom we never actually encounter and who dies off screen. A proper plot twist requires at least some degree of foreshadowing to hint that a seemingly helpful NPC might have motivations that don't align with our own.
Partitio, leave these guards to me. I'm glad we met, Partitio. Go, Partitio! And don't look back! Go on! The world's counting on you.
A secondary challenge lies in designing the game's mechanics that work within the framework of 8 distinct stories compiled into a single game. Each story features a different character with unique mechanics tailored to their background. Because benched party members don't passively gain experience points, you can run into situations such as an Ochette story where you're forced to duel an NPC to progress. This encounter with Alpine was perhaps my first real roadblock in her second chapter, since my Ochette was still level 1 and stood no chance of victory. I had to venture into the wild to grind levels and capture monsters before I could continue her story. Hikari faces a similar issue because his day action revolves around dueling, forcing me as the player into the awkward situation where I have to duel an NPC with a severely underleveled character. Moreover, because each chapter is dedicated to a specific character who must be used throughout the chapter, any character benched for most of the game ultimately becomes dead weight. This is especially problematic for damage dealers like Throne, Hikari, Oswald, and Ochette, whereas the others at least offer utility options that can support the party. The final challenge is creating a cast of 8 characters who all have interesting stories to tell, a task the writers handled better than its predecessor, but still fell short in some areas. While I liked Agnea's story overall, her third chapter repeats many of the same beats as her second. In chapter 2, she arrives in New Delsta, where she attends Dulcinea's performance, an event that further inspires her dream to perform.
So that was all for you.
Well, you've got some hot moves, kid.
Afterward, she meets a man, Gil, who hires her to sing at his coffee shop.
What say we get the show started?
Though he's discouraged about pursuing his dream of becoming a pianist, Agnea encourages him to keep going, using her street performances to draw customers to lift his spirits.
What happened here? Are you alright? Your face is... You said that man managed the theater, right? He has no right to trample on the dreams of others. So I'm gonna go over there and give him an earful.
Trouble shows up, Agnea steps in to resolve it, and the chapter ends on a satisfying note. This chapter does a great job of establishing Agnea as a genuinely optimistic woman, someone who uses her charm and kindness to bring out the best in those around her. The problem is that chapter 3 repeats this exact formula. She meets the same types of people, helps them chase their dreams, performs, and the story wraps up without any meaningful progression. While her 4th and 5th chapters echo a similar emotional beats, those at least build towards her final conclusion. Chapter 3, on the other hand, adds nothing. If you removed it entirely along with its characters, Agnea's story would still play out as intended, and arguably be better for it. Remember, the greatest sin a writer can commit is wasting his audience's time. Castti's story has several problems, the main one being that she's a very shallow archetype, the goody two-shoes lawful character with amnesia. For context, she's part of a nomadic tribe of doctors who worship Doter, the goddess of charity, and are dedicated to traveling the world to heal the sick. While noble in concept, this characterization severely limits the story's potential. Think about it realistically. Would a grizzled military captain really let Castti waltz into enemy territory just to heal his wounded foes?
Those people are in need of my aid, and so to their aid I go.
You think I'll just stand here and let you help our enemies?
Given how selfish and pragmatic he's shown to be, he'd sooner kill her than toss her body in a ditch. But the writers twist his behavior just to keep her story moving. That betrays his character, and in doing so, breaks the suspension of disbelief. Worse, Castti's 2nd and 3rd chapters barely matter. She spends them repeating the same actions in a desperate attempt to recover her memories, something that ultimately delays the real story, which doesn't begin until her 4th chapter. We eventually learned that the apothecaries of Castti's tribe, were committed to healing the ailing, but one of her closest confidants, Chausiu, is converted by one of Vados' death cultists and begins spreading a plague via a poison called Purple Rain, which wipes out their entire village. Once Castti regains her memories, she pursues this corrupted healer to a castle rooftop in Timberrain, where she finally ends his madness.
I swear to you, I will stop Trousseau.
Now that could have been a compelling arc. A healer chasing a madman who became the exact opposite of everything she stood for. He could have been her Joker, her Moriarty, but instead the writers botched it by wasting too much time on amnesia filler. Hikari's story suffers in a similar way. He's another noble-hearted do-gooder, but his conflict is muddied by a subplot about a shadow that tempts him to give in to bloodlust. I assume this shadow is supposed to contrast General Mugen, Hikari's antagonist, who gives in to bloodlust, but the message could have been delivered more effectively without these supernatural elements. The shadow doesn't influence the story, it doesn't change anything, it's just there. Castti's amnesia and Hikari's shadow are both vain attempts to add depth to characters the writers clearly didn't know how to make interesting on their own. Rather than working within the limitations of their lawful personalities, the game tries to compensate with bloated subplots that distract more than they develop. One story ends up spinning its wheels, while the other gets pulled off course. What I'm proposing isn't a rewrite, it's a simplification. If a character's story doesn't work, strip it down to what does. Make Castti the Batman chasing the madman. Keep Hikari's story, but drop the shadow. Keep it brief, because if you think your character is poorly written and cannot be rewritten, then remember this rule. The more a bad character speaks, the more noticeable they become, so keep them brief and hope the audience does not notice. On the other hand, Ochette's story is pure simplicity. She's tasked with saving her people by tracking down 3 godlike monsters, essentially collecting plot devices, to stop the encroaching shadow. Despite being as basic as it gets, her story still outperforms Hikari's and Castti's for one simple reason.
I'm indifferent to it.
Ochette is written with the naivety of a child exploring a vast new world, which can be either enduring or annoying depending on your taste. Personally, my only real complaint is that some of the characters she meets get a bit preachy about issues that most people, including myself, would overwhelmingly reject.
But humans are ugly. They kill out of avarice and greed.
Beyond that, whether you enjoy Ochette's story really comes down to how you feel about her as a character. In my case, I'm indifferent to her precisely because her story never goes out of its way to actively annoy me.
Howdy there. Name's Partitio.
Partitio's story is interesting, but weird. He's basically a capitalist philanthropist, like Andrew Carnegie, but without the capital. He wants to buy a steam engine to advance his ideology of progress, which is noble, but has to borrow absurd sums from others to do it. His motivations are a bit baffling in that regard. To conclude, Oswald's story is alright, but it exposes the game's biggest structural problem: splitting the narratives across 8 separate characters. I didn't notice it at first, but each arc leans heavily on flashbacks tied to a character's past. In some cases, like Temenos, they serve a clear purpose for the ongoing investigation. In others, such as Throne, Hikari, and Castti, the intent is to highlight personal trauma. But when flashbacks are used too frequently to reinforce what the audience already understands, they begin to feel excessive. Oswald's arc suffers the most from this. His motivation is straightforward: avenge his murdered family by killing Harvey. But instead of building on that premise, the game repeatedly cuts back to the same memories, as if afraid the player will forget what's at stake. Rather than deepening the story, these scenes start to drag it down. By chapter 4, I found myself tuning out, not because the story lacked weight, but because it kept restating the obvious. In spite of everything, Octopath Traveler 2's structure gives us both the best and worst of this approach. Its lack of commitment to an overarching narrative lets it avoid certain complexities, but it also makes it struggle to tie everything together. At its core, the entire foundation is built on individual narratives of its characters rather than any meaningful shared story, so the game concludes as soon as those individual arcs end. While this story is an overall improvement over its predecessor, it raises the question of whether the series will stick with this approach for a potential third entry. I did enjoy my playthrough of the second game, but I'm not sure I want to repeat exactly the same experience for the next one.